I'm going to talk about the Asia-Pacific pivot, the impact of militarization on the Philippines. But let me first put the Asia-Pacific pivot in perspective. We have to look at the big picture, that is the continuing expansion and hegemony of global capital. The U.S. is still the dominant player in the competition for the control of world resources, of cheap raw materials, cheap labor, of markets for manufactured goods, and of areas for profitable investments. However, the U.S. is being challenged by China and others in the so-called BRIC nations. To protect this economic empire, the United States has established a global military presence. It has divided the world into 10 global commands, which was mentioned earlier, and the picture that we see here shows close to 1,000 military bases, access agreements, and various forms of military cooperation with foreign countries. You might ask, why the focus of the pivot on Asia-Pacific? I see two very important reasons. One is that China is the emerging and serious challenger to U.S. global dominance. And second, the Asia-Pacific region has been identified as the zone of rapid economic growth. It is also the source of cheap raw materials, vast resources, huge market for manufactured goods, and profitable areas of investments. The U.S. pivot and the Philippines, the impact of militarization on the country. Pentagon planners have identified the Philippines as an important component of the U.S. pivot. First, because as a former colony, the Philippine ruling elites have demonstrated their loyal support to U.S. foreign policy, as demonstrated in the Pacific War against Japan during the Second World War, during the Cold War, during the Korean War and the Vietnam War. The Philippines has always, as they call it, the tail of the U.S. kite, sending soldiers to fight the wars of Uncle Sam, even though we don't know why we were fighting the Vietnamese. They were not our enemies, but we have done that. The U.S. never really has left the Philippines. Even after formal independence was granted in 1946, the U.S. saw to it that the colonial ties, the economic, political, and military, remained intact. In this slide, you can see President Reagan is shown welcoming his friend, the Philippine dictator Ferdinand Marcos, and wife Imelda in the White House. The U.S. provided military training and weapons to Marcos and his military minions, which were used to oppress the people who resisted martial law. Tens of thousands were jailed. Many were tortured and made to disappear. I know this for a fact because I came from the military, but I became a political prisoner of the Marcos dictatorship because I opposed it. I was kept in detention for more than 3.5 years without charges. In 1998, the Visiting Forces Agreement, so-called, replaced the bases agreement, which was not renewed. Here you can see thousands of U.S. troops arriving in the Philippines for the annual, what they call the balikatan, or shoulder-to-shoulder military exercises, which they do every year, like the Korean and U.S. Exercises. As mentioned earlier, U.S. naval vessels like this U.S. aircraft carrier escorted by a destroyer and a frigate from Guam and Pearl Harbor. They freely enter the Philippines, the Philippine Sea. And then we can see, today, we can see U.S. warplanes. Here you can see a U.S. F-16 Falcon taking off at Clark Air Base in the Philippines. Although Clark is no longer a U.S. air base, U.S. warplanes can use it again at no upkeep and maintenance expenses on the part of the U.S. U.S. Marine Chinook helicopters taking off from a Basa Air Base in the Philippines. This is a Philippine Air Force base, but now the U.S. Air Force can use it as well as other airfields in the Philippines. The U.S. aircraft carrier, USS George Washington, anchored in Manila Bay. Many U.S. warships make frequent visits to Manila today, where they resupply for provisions and servicing, and their officers and enlisted personnel take their R&R, meaning rest and recreation, in the bars and motels of Manila. The USS Frank Gable, a submarine tender, is shown here, anchored at the port city in Cebu City. Now, before it was only Subic that was being used. Now, they are in Cebu, they are in Mindanao, they are everywhere in the Philippines. And yet, the Philippine Constitution prohibits the introduction of bases of troops in the Philippines. I will discuss later on how this happened. The Asia pivot reinforces U.S. military intervention in the Philippines. How? Well, U.S. soldiers are sent to the Philippines to teach Filipino soldiers how to fight and kill Filipino peasant guerrillas who have their own grievances against the governing elite in the Philippines. The common excuse, if you ask them why they are there, is it is to train Filipino soldiers and to conduct humanitarian work and engage in disaster relief. They are also training them for mutual, what they call, if there is a common enemy, they can cooperate and use the same weapons together. As mentioned earlier, the Joint Special Operations Task Force, Philippines they call it, operating under the command of by the way, the Pacific Command is now being changed because of the pivot into the Asia Pacific Command, because of the Asia Pacific pivot. But it still has the same jurisdiction. Now, to circumvent the constitutional prohibition to maintain bases in the Philippines, the U.S. Special Operations Task Force is billeted inside Armed Forces of the Philippines military camps in Mindanao, for example, in Jolo, in Zamboanga, and other parts of Mindanao. Their common excuse is they are visiting and they are, replaced by new batches, but that is not true. The close to 700 Special Operations Forces in Mindanao have been there about a decade already, almost about 10 years already. They even have a liaison group, even billeted in a building in the general headquarters in Camp General Aguinaldo in Quezon City. Here, a member of the U.S. Special Operations Forces is giving instruction to a Filipino soldier. The Philippine soldiers aboard a U.S.-supplied armored vehicle are engaged in military operations in rural villages in Mindanao. Now, what happens is the Philippine Armed Forces and the police are protecting U.S. multinational corporations, especially the mining companies in Mindanao. when there are indigenous people leaders who protest against this intrusion of the multinationals and depriving them of their lands, the U.S. military hits back. The leaders, sometimes they're killed. And here we can see protesting demonstrators, protesting the murder of the pregnant wife and 2 children of Dagyon Capion. He was an IP, indigenous people leader, by the military protecting ex-Strata. That is a huge multinational corporation, mining corporation in Mindanao. The Mindanao indigenous people even go to the Manila, you know, that is about 600 miles, to protest, to stop the killings of indigenous people over the extrajudicial killings of their leaders. And this happened only very recently. In another killings, we call the Philippines, in the Philippines we call it the Hacienda Luisita Massacre. Hacienda Luisita is a huge plantation owned by the family of President Benigno Aquino. It was acquired through government funding. And because of that, it was supposed to be distributed to the peasants tilling the land after a certain number of years. The peasants never got the land promised to them. And so, the continuous protests. What happened is the military and the police protecting the hacienda gunned them down, and it occurred by shooting unarmed, peaceful peasant demonstrators. Here you can see one of the victims, one of the protesting peasants killed by the military in the Hacienda Luisita Massacre. Now, even church leaders are not spared. Here we can see a bishop, the Obispo Maximo of the Philippine Independent Church, who was supporting the Hacienda Luisita farmers. He was assassinated in his residence by hired killers linked to the security forces. So, church people are also protesting this kind of, demanding justice for these killings. And there are peasants and workers continuously demanding land, food, and justice. Now, of course, the government, dominated by landlords and big business people, consider this as subversive. But these people are, I came from the military. I know that they were demanding only justice. They have been exploited for decades. And that's why I was also protesting when I was in the service. And what did they do to me? When Marshall declared martial law, I was targeted for arrest because I was a subversive. Okay. Now, here you can see the 2 words that I'm talking about. We have the word of the wealthy and the word of the poor. And injustice, gross inequality, and poverty are among the causes of the rebellion of the poor. Now, environmental destruction is also a result also from this militarization. The world-renowned Tubataha Reefs, located in Palawan, designated by the UN as a World Heritage Park, was destroyed by the USS Guardian, a U.S. naval warship which ran aground after being warned by the Philippine authorities managing the World Heritage Park. They disregarded the warning. It ran aground and destroyed a sizable part of the... Now, in summary, let me say that the U.S. pivot in Asia-Pacific has increased and intensified U.S. military presence in the Philippines, which resulted in the following. 1, the continuing surrender of sovereign rights of the Filipino people. by the ruling elites. U.S. military personnel are given rights akin to diplomatic immunity. For instance, a U.S. soldier who raped a Filipino woman went unpunished and was sent home to the United States. Second, the violation of Article 18 of the Philippine Constitution, and I will quote. After the expiration in 1991 of the agreement between the Republic of the Philippines and the United States of America concerning military bases, foreign military bases, troops, or facilities shall not be allowed in the Philippines except under a treaty concurred in by the Philippine Senate and recognized as a treaty by the other contracting state. The United States Senate did not ratify the Visiting Forces Agreement because they said it was not a treaty, it was an agreement. So there is need. So in effect, we are not supposed to allow foreign troops and the use of Philippine territory. And then, of course, the training and weapons provided by the U.S. to Filipino troops and police are used to repress protesting workers, peasants, students, and the killing of indigenous people's leaders, the gross violation of human rights of social activists, church people who are supporting those exploited, marginalized people. And finally, there is a quid pro quo between the ruling elites in our country and the United States government. And the U.S., in exchange for the privileges given to the United States, it provides assistance and support, including military training and weapons, to support a corrupt ruling system dominated by a few wealthy families who resist substantive democratic change demanded by the Filipino people. Thank you for listening.